a little pop-up might come on your screen just to say that you're okay with being in the meeting whilst it's being recorded. So welcome to today's training on working within diversity, everything kind of around anti-oppressive practice. And today really for me is both a opportunity to kind of walk you through the working within diversity model, very much kind of its foundations and roots are all about anti-oppressive practice. And then within that, we're going to specifically be looking at a couple of components and a couple of concepts within the anti-oppressive model as well. So it feels like both today is an overview of a really big, huge, broad topic, but hopefully in a way that feels accessible and kind of tangible and easy to work with, because I'm very visual in my thinking, in my learning, and in my practice. So very much for me, this working within diversity model, when we get to looking at it, it's a kind of a visual framework, but it helps me very much to remind myself of then what's going on in the work and in the practice and how I kind of work with clients and supervisees. So we're going to kind of be looking at that today. So I feel on the one hand, it's a really today it does feel like a one-day intensive. There's a lot that we can think about today, but hopefully in a way that, as I said, feels accessible and tangible and also practical to actually use. Like, you're not going to walk away hopefully after today and feel like, well, I've learned that, great. Hopefully it will feel like, oh, this is something very practical that I can be applying and utilizing in my practice. So to start off with, again, let me just bring up, so I'm going to be slide sharing. Let me just bring up the right slide deck. There we go. And can people see that? Yep, lovely, thank you. So, as I've said, kind of today is all about working within diversity. If anybody is unfamiliar with me and my work, to put kind of today in context, today essentially, as I said, it's a one-day intensive based on the book Working Within Diversity. And so this book was published last July, so we're kind of coming up to almost a year of it being published. And essentially this book is a culmination of what is kind of now almost 15 years of clinical experience of me working with clients and supervisees and delivering teaching and training, both kind of generally in terms of training counsellors, actually teaching a diploma, as well as delivering more specialist kind of CPD workshops and trainings on the issues of diversity and identity. And it's through all of that experience that what essentially culminated in writing this book. And so this book is a capture of what I believe is, and what is my position and understanding of not only what anti-oppressive practice actually is, but how we can actually develop that in our work. And so today, as I've said, is kind of a snapshot of that. So everything that we're going to be covering today is material either in, from, or based upon the book. So if today piques your interest, if you want to learn more, if you want to kind of dive even deeper into the topics and things we're going to be thinking about today, then the book is definitely kind of the place to go. It very much explains in far more detail everything and more of what we're going to be thinking about today. So yeah, if people are unfamiliar of me and my work, then kind of today's workshop is based upon this. So very first thing I'm going to invite you to do is, again, an individual exercise. This is not a show and tell, so I'm not going to be asking you then to share it with the group afterwards, but really it's an opportunity for each of you to ground yourself in really ground and hold yourself in the space today, an opportunity to kind of check in with yourself. But I'm inviting each of you to write down one thing that you're hoping to learn from this training. And that might be in the form of a big question that you want to have answered. So just inviting you to two parts to this. Write down one thing that you're hoping to learn from this training. If it's more than one thing, that's absolutely fine. But it really is an invitation just to connect with why you're here today. So write down one thing that you're hoping to get and learn from today's training. And that might be then formed as, what's the big question that you want to have answered? Or it doesn't have to be a big question, but a question. What's a question that you would like to have answered from today's training? So just a couple of minutes to capture where you are at the start of today. And as I've mentioned, I'm not going to be inviting you to share. It really is an opportunity to check in with yourself about what you're hoping to get from today. Okay. Now, this is the one thing, one difference between training online and training in person. With whenever I'm inviting you to kind of capture thoughts, reflection throughout the day, and where we have moments like this, I'm basing it whether your head is down or up. Essentially, if you're writing or not. So I'm kind of taking it, but basically on body language. That as people kind of look back up at the screen, I'm like, okay, maybe you've finished writing. So if at any point you are still writing and need a little bit more time, again, please just unmute or nudge me and just say, Myra, I just need a minute more or so. Okay. So I'm going to be checking in with you in these spaces just to check that everybody has enough time as well. Okay. So yeah, so based on everyone looking back up, I'm assuming there is enough time. Or you've had enough time rather. So I'm going to be, as I've mentioned at the start, I'm going to be talking through a few slides each time and then coming back to the gallery for kind of thoughts, questions, reflections, and a bit of a discussion. There are a couple of breakout room activities at some point, but they're kind of further into today, just in case anybody's wondering what that type of structure of today might look like. So there will be opportunity for you to go into smaller groups and do a couple of activities together. But because of the kind of the broadness and depth of these sessions, I do often like to keep us in these large group discussions so that everyone is learning from each other. So I hope that is kind of suitable and okay with everybody. But as I said, there will be opportunity to go into some smaller groups as well. So, as I said, the purpose of these questions is really just to just attune to where you are at the start of today. In terms of then throughout the day, checking in with perhaps what you've written in terms of, are you getting what you wanted? And throughout the day, are those questions, any big question, are they being answered or not? And if they're not, perhaps it's about how you might want to bring that in or ask that during some of the discussions as well. So again, I really hope that today you are leaving with kind of getting what you want from today. Okay. So to move into kind of the first section of kind of the teaching element of today really is, in thinking about working within diversity, is to recognise that our starting point in thinking about becoming an anti-oppressive practitioner or developing our practice as an anti-oppressive approach is for me to intentionally make that very intentional, conscious decision to move from a position of working with diversity to working within diversity, because that pivot, that move, is actually moving us from an oppressive to an anti-oppressive position. And I will explain what I mean by that in a second. But the starting point is but the movement, the approach is to recognize that we are making this intentional pivot from working with to working within diversity. And I'm going to deconstruct what I mean by that in a moment. But really at this point, it's to recognize that to be an anti-oppressive practitioner, or to develop or to think about offering an anti-oppressive approach or practice, is to intentionally be and do anti-oppressive work. We do not by default or unconsciously automatically offer an anti-oppressive practice or approach. For me, it has to be a very conscious, intentional choice, because, and I think this will become very obvious from today, it is because our practice and the position of therapy and how we are taught in our training by default is actually within a very oppressive structure. It actually comes from a particular position within structural and systemic frameworks that means that unconsciously, unintentionally, without us perhaps being aware of it, our training is embedded within oppressive systems. So in order to become and to move into anti-oppressive approaches, practices, and being an anti-oppressive practitioner, we have to consciously and intentionally move away, pivot away from what is kind of the natural default oppressive position of our work. And as I said, I'm going to explain that, or deconstruct it to explain that in a second. So it is to recognize that our starting position, or rather default position, through training and through how therapy is taught, how therapy is positioned within structural and systemic frameworks, we are by default actually offering, unfortunately, and we are repeating and replaying quite oppressive practices and positions. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today, making that move and what that move looks like. And when we're in that anti-oppressive position, then what that actually means. But before we get into any of that specifically, we have to understand, first of all, our definitions and what we mean by these quite, I think, big, heavy words and language that we're going to be using today and thinking about today. So some definitions here. These are my definitions that then are referenced in the book. So again, moving forward, I know some people like to have a primary reference for this material. The definitions that I use, the concepts that I use, are defined by me, and they are in the book if you need a primary source reference for this moving forward. So if we are making this intentional pivot from oppressive to anti-oppressive, we have to actually know what we mean by this. So what do we mean by oppressive practice? So oppression is the systematic targeting or marginalization of one social group by another social group for the benefit of the more powerful social group. So oppression is a relational dynamic. It is one social group that targets or marginalizes another social group for their own benefit, for the benefit of that more powerful social group. What that then means, or what it might look like in practice, can be through ignoring, denying, or removing any acknowledgement of that inequality. So both of that inequality out there in the rest of the world, in terms of that structural and systemic frameworks and inequalities, but also in the in-here space between counsellor and client, supervisor and supervisee, if in supervision, or between tutor and student in any counselling teaching environment. So oppression broadly and generally out there will be this more powerful social group that targets and marginalises another social group for their own benefit. And how that can then show up for us is by us ignoring, denying, or removing any acknowledgement of that out there and in here. And when we ignore, deny, or remove any acknowledgement of this inequality, of the oppression, we are then directly, indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, then repeating it in here. And by repeating in here, our clients, our supervisees, our students re-experience their out there experiences of oppression in here. So it gets repeated in here. Again, I just want to give everyone a moment. I appreciate people want to kind of jot down any notes about this, reflections, please do. I'm going to hold that slide up so people have the opportunity to, as I said, capture thoughts, reflections. So there is something in this work in which we are recognizing that both oppression exists out there, and if we are to ignore it and not recognize that it exists, we are then repeating it in here. So this pivot that I spoke about a moment ago, this pivot of moving from oppressive practice to anti-oppressive, is because if we're not acknowledging oppression, we're actually in an oppressive position ourselves, and we are repeating it in here. And when I say in here, I mean that clinical space, which might be the counselling space, equally the supervision space, or the teaching space. So if we don't acknowledge oppression, we are actually then colluding with it and repeating it in here. Okay. So if we are then making that pivot, if we're recognizing that unless we are intentional about anti-oppressive practice, unless we are intentionally recognizing oppression exists, as I said, by default, we stay in that oppressive position. So on the flip side then, what is it we're trying to do then? What is it we mean by anti-oppressive practice? I kind of do this. Becomes quite a heavy, a text-heavy slide, but as I said, you're going to get copies of these slides. Again, what I encourage you to do is to jot down and capture your responses, your thoughts in response to this. So what do we mean by anti-oppressive practice? So anti-oppressive practice, therefore then, the flip side of oppression is we're explicitly acknowledging structural and systemic inequalities. So therefore, we are explicitly acknowledging that there are systems of oppression, and that there is then, therefore then, that a power oppression relational dynamic between these two social groups or two individuals or any two communities, that with oppression being one social group targets or marginalizes a less dominant or less powerful group. So we're acknowledging that oppression essentially is about this power relational dynamic. So anti-oppressive practice, its very starting point is explicitly acknowledging then that these inequalities exist. And these inequalities exist because there is this power relational dynamic. We then build upon this by recognizing that that these structural systemic inequalities exist. We can then acknowledge and support an understanding of how each of us then is shaped by our lived experiences, and that our lived experience takes place within these underlying systemic and structural contexts. And if our lived experience exists within this structural and systemic context, we can then start to understand which end of this power relational dynamic we experience. Where in our lived experience do we experience oppression? And where in our lived experience might we hold a more powerful position? Where might we have privilege in our lives? So it's recognizing, so the first step is this structural systemic inequality. And then within this systemic structural framework context, we all exist. All of our lived experiences take place within this context. So for each and every one of us, we are all experiencing these relational dynamics of power and oppression. And what we do is we experience both ends of the spectrums depending on context, situation, who we are, who the other person is. And we're going to be thinking about that in a lot more detail in a moment. So it's about recognizing that ultimately, I suppose what I'm trying to say with this part is to say that these structural and systemic inequalities don't exist away from us or outside of us. We all exist within them. Yeah. We think of kind of structure and systemic framework almost like, think of it like Google Maps. Yeah. And we all live within, like with that little yellow icon that we kind of drag and drop into Google Maps. We are all those people inside this framework. And so our lived experience is born out of what we experience within this framework, within this context. And where and how do we experience oppression? And where and how do we experience power and privilege? And no one is exempt from this. It's not something that is, othered. It's not something outside of us. We are all within this structural and systemic context. By recognizing then that we all exist within this systemic and structural context, we can then recognize that in our work, we can then support the facilitation and approach to offer a relational dynamic of equality. Because if out there we experience inequality, we are then intentionally trying to offer a relational dynamic of equality in here. Excuse me. And we are then looking to flatten that power oppression hierarchy in our practice, in our processes, and in our relationships. So within our therapeutic supervision or teaching relationships. And what's really important to note here is when I talk about flattening the power oppression hierarchy, I'm not talking about getting rid of power. But instead, when we think about this power oppression hierarchy or relationship like a seesaw, it's like trying to equalize and bring that seesaw so that each person at the end of this seesaw of power are level. We're looking to equalize that seesaw. So we can't flatten in terms of get rid of. What I mean by flatten is it's by flattening out that hierarchy so that there is a relational dynamic of equality that we are offering between ourselves and our client, supervisee, or students if we're teaching. What we are then doing in our work, we are then recognizing that for all of us, there is an out there context within which all of us have our lived experiences of privilege and or oppression. So not only are we trying to flatten the hierarchy in here, we're also recognizing that in our relationships, we all bring into our relationships our lived experience and out there context. So we all hold lived experiences of privilege and or oppression. Again, this is really important to note then that none of us exist outside of this system. We all exist within this out there context. And so all of us hold experiences of privilege and or oppression. And ultimately then, in anti-oppressive practice, what we're trying to do is we are then recognizing that when there is out there structural inequalities and an out there context of structural and systemic inequalities, there is also a structural inequality in the in here context as well. And because our in here context is not a vacuum or a bubble that is separate from the out there, that the structural and systemic context out there, the framework out there, is what has created our in here context. And so the in here is not immune to structural inequality. And so what we're then doing is not only are we acknowledging that, first of all, we are then working to flatten again that power, to equalize that seesaw between counsellor client, between supervisor supervisee. So we're offering both a therapeutic process and relationship which holds the client in equal regard to the counsellor, without the client being marginalised, minoritised or othered by the counsellor and or counselling service. So we are ultimately recognising that there is an out there systemic and structural context, and we all have our out there experiences of privilege and power and oppression. And also the in here also has a structural and systemic context of inequality by default, as I mentioned, unintentionally and consciously. And so what we are looking to do consciously then is to move into a position to then flatten that power and to have that seesaw of power and hierarchy. We're looking to flatten it, and we're looking to hold ourselves in equality and to offer an equal process and relationship with our client or supervisee and students. So kind of almost in a nutshell here, kind of this slide defines what anti-oppressive practice actually is. And I think I just want to add in here really that often we can think that anti-oppressive practice is purely about just the relationship between me and my client. I think it can often get minimized and reduced down to the relationship itself. And actually for me, anti-oppressive practice is about the entire context of our work. So this is about anti-oppressive practice, anti-oppressive supervision, anti-oppressive relationships, anti-oppressive training, anti-oppressive self-care. And I talk about all of that in the book. There are these kind of 4 components to anti-oppressive practice. It's about the training, the teaching, the counselling, the supervision, and self-care. So it's about the entire profession. It's about all of our work, all of the context within which we work. And part of that, of course, is about the relationship with our clients, but that is only part of a broader anti-oppressive practice context. So it's taking into account all of these layers, the out there and the in here, and how the in here, if we are not careful, if we're not intentional, repeats the out there inequalities. So we are looking to offer an in here equality so that we are not repeating the out there inequalities. Again, I'm going to hold this slide up. I'll keep this slide up rather, and I'm going to invite you to, if you haven't already, capture any thoughts, reflections, and also any questions, because after this, I'm going to bring us back into the gallery and open it up for a bit of a discussion. But I just want to hold the slide up there just to offer people an opportunity to sit with this, as I said, to capture any thoughts, feelings, reflections. I kind of just want to say, really, I appreciate this is kind of a big kind of starting point of today, but we are going to be kind of deconstructing and looking at this in detail, the whole point of today. So if this kind of feels big, overwhelming, it does, and it is, please sit with it. And we are going to be kind of working through all of this today and what it might mean for us to kind of flatten that power, flatten that hierarchy.
Hi, Myra.
Hi, Tanya. Yes.
Hi. I was just really kind of thinking about this in the context of systemic context and how, as a therapist, sometimes you are part of the oppressive system, whilst yourself feeling oppressed by the system, working with a patient or client that is also marginalized, but in relation to you is either in a position of more power or less power, depending on what group they represent, and how all of that plays out at different points in time, and how sometimes it's so hard to create a sense of where the client sees you as being at the same level, because the minute you walk out of that room, you are part of the system. And I'm kind of reflecting because I work in prisons.
Yes.
And so one of the hardest things for me is when I say to patients very regularly, there are a lot of things that I have no control over. And there are a lot of things, I agree to see you every Tuesday at 2 o'clock, for example. But I don't even have control over that, because if the prison regime changes, I might not be able to see you.
Yes.
And it's about making it very clear that there is a level of power that I hold, and a level of powerlessness that I also hold within the system.
Yes.
And then it all kind of plays out all at the same time.
Mm.
And that our power dynamic actually changes quite a lot, because
Yes.
sometimes, in regards to where they are and how they behave, my power can be taken away quite quickly as well. Um, and it's this kind of constant dance of understanding, I guess, power and privilege, because they don't always come together either. So yeah, sorry, I just loads of thoughts
Yeah.
going through my head.
No, no, thank you so much, Tanya, for sharing that. Absolutely. I think a couple of things in that. One is that you're absolutely recognizing that it gets played out in here if we, well, two parts to that. One is it gets played out in here irrespective of whether we're aware of it or not. Like most often, if we're not taught, and this is why I say that in the training, if we're not taught it in the training, it will automatically by default be repeated and replayed in the in here space. And often it does because we're not taught it, because we're not aware of it. And then the second part to that is, even once we are aware of it, I think it's about what can we do within our power to equalize it, but also to recognize where there are going to be elements, like you gave really good examples there, Tanya, where because we're part of the system, where our power is being held, or not being held, but where our power does come into play with our client. When we get onto the power section in today's workshop specifically, for me, I think when we think about the different types of power, for me, it's into what you've said in response to what you said, Tanya. It's about recognizing and being aware as practitioners where and how we hold power and how we utilize it, because there is a difference between us utilizing power in an oppressive way versus an anti-oppressive way. So we're going to be thinking about that a little bit later today, but just to hold on to this idea that there is not one form of power. And so I think it's really important that as we kind of start to move into thinking about how to be anti-oppressive practitioners, it's recognizing that it's not about getting rid of our power, as I said earlier. It's about being intentional and conscious of the power I do have. How am I utilizing it? And can I utilize it to offer an equality with my clients? So, yeah. Thank you, Tanya, for sharing that. Mona, please.
Yeah, actually, I think Tanya kind of triggered some thoughts that I was having, so maybe it's kind of a bit of a follow-on.
Yeah, sure.
But I guess for me, it's something about like who decides who has the power and like who decides who is oppressed. And if I think particularly about therapeutic relationships, I can have clients in front of me who are expressing that they are oppressed because of X, Y, and Z, often about different identities. And I can be looking at them with my lived experience of oppression and research and my own learnings that I've done around oppression, particularly identities.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sitting there going, well, you're not oppressed. What are you talking about? Whereas, they have a right to say they're oppressed, or do they? So, like, where does it become they're identifying as oppressed, therefore it is? Is it about where do you challenge them? Is it about thinking, what is my power within that to challenge them? So it's something I've had to take to supervision myself. It turns out I have an issue with white men who know. And so there's a certain kind of, I guess, result from my own lived experience within that. But then also thinking about, yeah, who has the ability to say they're oppressed? Is there like a checklist that people have to like fit to say that they're oppressed? Is it something that people can just declare? they're not really, I guess they're a bit like rhetorical questions rather than I'm expecting you to have the answer or anybody to have the answer. But it's just like, I guess, some of my reflections and thoughts that have been triggered.
No, really good questions, I think, for all of us to kind of hold in mind as we go through the material today, because I think you're speaking to a particular concept that I have in mind as you're saying that, and I'd be really curious then to see how you might start to think about those questions, and or how you might start to come up with answers or responses to them as we go through today. But really, really good questions to be asking, because there is something about well, just that who gets, it was about, yeah, who gets to say, but there's something about, oh gosh, there's a word that's come to my head and it's just gone. There's almost something about who gets to own. There's something about an ownership here. There's something about, interestingly, there's almost a sense of who has the privilege to own, like who holds an actual level of privilege in society or in structural systems to actually position themselves as the oppressed. And there's kind of an almost like an irony in that somewhere. But yeah, I think it's very nuanced, but hold on to that idea that actually, how are people positioning themselves, and what might be going on for us in terms of our construction of our identity that means that we hold that as our dominant position. My mind's thinking about lots of things that we're going to be thinking about throughout today, so kind of hold on to those, men. They're really good questions, and as a group we can kind of start to think about that together as well, so thank you. Anybody else kind of inviting space for people to share their thoughts, reflections on thinking about this pivot, this move from oppressive to anti-oppressive, and what that might mean for you, and what that might mean perhaps in relation to your current practice?
I
Chris,
did.
hi.
It was just probably more of a clarification, because
Sure.
it was similar to what perhaps Tanya was saying. Just how do I suppose if I'm thinking it from like a kind of teacher-student perspective, how do those power dynamics do I consciously separate, like the hierarchy but that naturally comes with a teacher and student, and I suppose especially if they're a lot younger and it becomes more adult to child. And then how do you, yeah, like I suppose maybe you touched on it, like utilizing your power more consciously and separating that power dynamic from like a oppressive, anti-oppressive power.
Yeah, so really good question there, Christine, because I think what we're getting into is when we automatically hold a level of role power, and again, we're going to be thinking about this today, but I'll jump ahead to it already. We will go through it in more detail later, but there's something here about we're recognizing that as a counsellor, as a tutor or supervisor, we hold a role power. It is then recognizing that in that role power that we hold, how am I, again, utilizing and exercising my power? Am I using it in order to going back to that seesaw of power? Am I using it to hold an authority over, a power over the other student, supervisee, client? Or am I utilizing my power in order to offer an equality in the relationship? And that's the bit for me that we are moving. That's kind of the starting point to, or gateway into anti-oppressive practice, which is I'm recognizing that I hold role power. I recognize that I could essentially do one of two things with it. I can either use it to oppress, or I can use it to equalize and flatten power. And it's at that point that we are making then a conscious, intentional decision. And when I talk about then we can use it to either oppress and hold power over, or to equalize the relationship, it's about recognizing that if I hold onto my power and use it in an oppressive manner, what that might look like is, am I doing something to marginalize, minimize, shame, deny, ignore the other person or any aspect of what they're wanting to talk about? Making up an example here, but let's let's imagine in front of us, because specifically because you mentioned, Christine, kind of in a teaching environment, let's hypothetically think about a teaching group, and there is this teacher, and you have a student who is sharing perhaps their lived experience in a counselling training environment, and they are sharing their experience. Now, an obvious way then that as the tutor, I can dominate, I can utilise my role power in an oppressive manner would be to simply ignore or deny what that student is sharing. And that might be a student just talking about an aspect of their lived experience, and it might mean I can deny it by going, oh, it couldn't have been that bad, or other people have got it worse, or, oh, I know you've had that experience, but actually let's think about other people as well. So what I'm doing is I'm taking what I call part of their truth, and I'm doing something to it. So what we find ourselves is that when we hold role power as a counsellor, supervisor, or tutor, it is about being conscious and intentional of how we are holding that other person's truth. And am I doing anything to it to, as I said, deny, ignore, minimize, marginalize that experience or that truth or any aspect of their truth? Yeah. And I think that's the difference, as opposed to being an anti-oppressive practitioner. It would be that same student sharing their truth and me going, oh, that's really, say more, let's think about it. How do you experience that, whatever it might be that they are sharing? But there's something about them holding that truth as their truth. So I'm holding it as equal in its experience and value and credibility as my own. I'm not saying that my truth or anybody else's truth in this group is more important or more valid than theirs. Rather, I'm saying yours is absolutely valid because it's your truth. So let's hold it with that level of respect and validity. And for me, it comes from a place of kind of respect. I'm really mindful that's one of my values when I talk about anti-oppressive practice, which is I am holding somebody else's truth with all of that respect and value and credibility and honesty. Yeah, so that would be the difference. Yeah. And I'm sure throughout the day, we're going to come up with lots of examples of that. Yeah. So I hope that, Christine, kind of answers
that's
in a way.
really helpful. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Anybody else would like to kind of share, reflect, ask a question about anything we've covered so far? Yvette, please.
It's just that it's following on from Tanya and Mona. That was my very first question, believe it or not. How do we work within a system that I see as oppressive? So we've kind of, it seems that it's a very similar vein.
Yes.
So you were talking just about truth.
Yes.
So I work one of my roles is that I work at a pupil referral unit with primary to 16 years of age. So I'm very, very more as an advocate, because I'm very, very passionate about hearing their voice.
Yes.
Because I find that young people are worked on, not with or as within, now that we're talking about, and that I find that whether they're 10, whether they're 15, they're very expressive and they know what they want. So if they're in the care system or they're on a social services plan, I find that, so I'm very passionate about getting their voice and confidentiality, and sometimes they use me as their voice, that I can't say this, and can you pass on this?
Yes.
What I found is I act as that voice and speak their truth, and then I get quite things in meetings, and I'm there, they override, and they say, well, they don't know what they're talking about and stuff. And then what I then get is when there's meetings, I get dropped off the meetings. And then I'm like, well, what have I done? I only spoke for that person, and I'm never gonna override. So that's where I struggle a little bit, because we're, as a therapist, we're holding and we're, that's what we're meant to do. We're meant to be moving them on, and they're always worked on. So I'm here as an advocate and a voice, and then that's overrode, and then that's when I get a little bit, I don't understand. That's where I get a bit frustrated.
Yeah.
so then and then I get on part, and then that's where I feel like I'm colluding, because I have to go back to this young person and said, oh, you know, you didn't want to do, but they've said it. Well, I've told you I didn't want to do it. And it's kind of like there's always that battle, and why the voice is not heard, and I'm not sure what I have to do. I take the supervision all the time, but it's bigger than me. You know, the system's
Yes.
bigger than me. This is,
Yes.
you know, but I will always just hold the young person, because that's what my job is, that's what my role is, and that's my innate to work with these people.
Yeah.
So that was just my reflection.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Yvette. I think again, what's really interesting in what you've shared is it's to recognise that there's I almost want to say there's two parts to this, but I think it's a part within a part. I think there's something about your role of absolutely holding the truth and the voice of that young person, and you being their advocate, their voice then in meetings. I think it's then taking that part and recognizing that it's within this bigger system. So it's kind of that part within this bigger part of the system. And then in my head, what I suppose where I'm going with that in my head is to recognize then that what ends up happening, I suppose my thought goes to something about what is being played out relationally. And so what you're actually talking about is what might often be a parallel process, which is if a young person out there is voiceless and is not heard, in here, and I mean the bigger context of your in here, not in your specific in here that therapeutic relationship, but in your broader context, then there's a parallel process being played out, which is then via you, the young person via you then is then voiceless in the in here system. And I kind of wanting to acknowledge that parallel process. And the reason I say that is because it's about us acknowledging when we step into anti-oppressive practice is to recognize, where am I within the in here system, and am I unconsciously colluding with the oppressive system? What am I doing that upholds it and reinforces it, or what can I do differently? And I know you're absolutely saying that I can part this bigger system. For me, it would be, and I appreciate this is kind of, I'm thinking this out loud in a way, but as opposed to going, right, what can I do differently with the young person? That part, that immediate in here part, that's not the issue. I think as an anti-oppressive practitioner, where you can where you want to then make change, or where you want to change things, is looking at that bigger part and going, how can my relationship with the bigger system, with the team, with the other people that I'm in conversation with in these meetings or not in those meetings, how can that be looked at? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So when I talk about being an anti-oppressive practitioner and we're in these systems and structures, it's not just what we do within the in here therapeutic relationships. It's also about how do we challenge the systems to go, hold on a minute, I'm being left out of meetings. I think the structure of how this work is thought about needs to be looked at. So you're challenging an aspect of the system as opposed to specifically changing anything in the therapeutic relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's just that my observation that certain communities, certain individuals that I work with are treated very different. So, for example, I work with predominantly a lot of Afro-Caribbean boys. I work with young Muslim boys, and they're treated very, very different, and it's really evident. And that is, even though it might be subtle, it might be, you know, unconscious or whatever, but there's automatically a stereotype, a stamp, and then that's it. You can't. It's a stamp before you've even got to the individual issues, the individual traumas. It's an individual stamp straight away.
Yes.
You know, so that can be very difficult. To work within.
Absolutely. And it's why, I mean, it's like going really broad here, kind of zooming out, but this is why making this intentional pivot into being anti-oppressive practitioners, it is absolutely not just to change the work that we do in here, but it is to challenge the very systems we exist within. So
but
for
when
me,
you do challenge it, it's denied. it's denied, and but then all of the evidence suggests that there's massive overrepresentation in criminal justice system,
Oh, yeah.
mental health, and so on. So it's not just me that's observed it then, you know.
Oh, no, absolutely not. And I think this is the thing about, which is why making this intentional pivot into anti-oppressive practice is to go against the default, is to go against the grain, is to go against the very structures that we exist within, because we're challenging the very structures that we exist within by doing this work. Yeah. So thank you, kind of, Yvette, for kind of highlighting kind of that aspect of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Amina, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with what Yvette was saying. There's some thoughts going on for me, and to some degree, I can kind of relate to Yvette. I also work. One of my roles is I work with offenders, so male offenders, and as an advocate. And I do find often my role isn't just to be a voice for the patients. Often I'm kind of trying to maneuver how I can work with the clinicians, because I have also experienced, as Yvette has said, that sometimes it's like I'm putting things forward and they're the professionals, they know what's right, and the individual's voice isn't being heard. So I'm finding I'm having to, okay, how can I word this? How can I build that relationship? It's awfully exhausting, because I'm like, we need to see where that person is and how can we keep that person central to this process. And it can be really, really and really exhausting. And I have seen other advocates come in, external ones, who, when they have been very challenging, I've never seen them again. So I don't know exactly what's gone on, but I've kind of heard, oh, okay, they were quite, loud with their opinions with the clinicians. So I also feel sometimes in my role, it is really challenging to try and kind of balance that seesaw, not just with our clients or patients, but within the external system.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Amina, for sharing. Yeah. What we're going to kind of move on to, and I should have said, my apologies, that we're going to kind of be taking a break in about kind of 20-25 minutes. But what we're going to do, kind of just to kind of round off, or to do within this kind of at the end of this kind of first section, then is to kind of offer some kind of deconstruction then to this pivot from the working with to working within. So we kind of have a context then of what this anti-oppressive practice looks like. So again, as I've mentioned, a few slides to use to go through. They're very visual slides because, again, I'm a visual thinker. So this is kind of a visual representational deconstruction of sorry, I'm trying to find the right slide, of how we can think about working, or rather making this pivot from working, moving from working with diversity to working within. So, oh, sorry, I should have mentioned this slide just before we go in. I think this is where actually it leads on really nicely to the conversation with the discussion we've just had, because in moving intentionally from working with to working within, as I've said, we are consciously then challenging the structures within which we work as a profession. And for me, anti-oppressive practice is to be working ethically, because if we don't, as I said, if we're not being intentional about being anti-oppressive, we are then actually unintentionally being oppressive, and that is not ethical. So for me, anti-oppressive practice is to actually be working ethically, and anti-oppressive practice then needs to be at the core of our ethical framework in clinical practice. And so for me, I see anti-oppressive practice not as a bolt-on, not as something to consider alongside or like the cherry on top of the work we do. It is about completely deconstructing the frameworks within which we already work within, and to reconstruct it with anti-oppressive being part of that framework. And that's essentially what I'm going to be kind of walking you through in a moment, is to how do we deconstruct and how do we reconstruct it so that anti-oppressive practice is what we might consider a core component. Just alongside, we might think about empathy or unconditional positive regard, congruence. Like for me, being anti-oppressive is a core component then of how we need to be not only as therapists, but how we need to be as ethical therapists and practitioners. So In order to think about what anti-oppressive practice looks like, we have to first of all think about, well, what's kind of wrong with where we're already at? Yeah. So what is the problem of working with diversity? And to explain this, I kind of talk us through what actually that looks like in a therapeutic relationship. So when we think about the concept of working with diversity, what we are essentially saying is that in the room, we have both a counsellor and a client. And when we are working with diversity, we are in therapeutic relationship with our client. We are focused on that client because we are working with diversity. And when we are working with diversity, diversity then as a label, as an identity itself, gets placed with the client. Just as we might say we are working with, insert client name here, so working with Myra, we are also saying that diversity almost becomes the label, the name, the category of the client. So when we say we're working with diversity, we place the entirety of diversity, we reduce it down to a label, to a little name badge maybe, and we stick it on the client. And every time I teach this slide and every time I see this slide, I always think of the metaphor of those blue English heritage plaques that are along the side of buildings where, I don't know, Charles Dickens lived here, someone famous lived here. And it's the equivalent of saying that diversity lives here with the client. So diversity can only therefore belong to the client, and the client's identity itself then is labelled as diverse and different, not as the actual client's identity, but their identity becomes the identity of diversity or diverse or difference or different. So it becomes the name badge itself. The client becomes this English, this blue English heritage plaque, and diversity lives here with the client. The moment we place that label of diversity with the client, because the actual word of diverse or different is a comparative word, because somebody can only be diverse and different if they are diverse and different from somebody else. When we then place diversity with the client, we are saying that they are diverse and different from another person. And in any therapeutic relationship, this is also applicable to supervision and teaching as well, by the way. But the moment we place diverse and or difference with the client, supervisor or student, we are saying that they are diverse and different from the other person. And that other person being in a therapeutic relationship than being diverse and different from the counsellor. Now, this is problematic for a number of reasons that I'm about to mention. However, the moment we place or say that the client is diverse and different, that they therefore are diverse and different from the counsellor, because we have taken the entirety of diversity and difference and we have squished it down into a little name tag and we've given it to the client, it has left the counsellor then being positioned as normative, centred and neutral in relationship to the client, because all of diversity and difference is the equivalent of saying all the colours in the world have been placed with the client. So the only thing I am left with is transparency. Let's go with that. Because of that, then, I am now placing myself, I've left myself with being normative, centred and neutral, that my identity is the norm, that my identity is what is a neutral identity, because any diversity or difference is with the client. So my identity as the counsellor then is then seen in a normative position. And the moment we place ourselves as normative, we are taking up a powerful and privileged position. Because we are saying in our identity then, we're saying about ourselves is that I am normative. I am the norm. You are different. You therefore are part of a non-dominant group. Your identity is one that is then marginalized. We wouldn't say that as the privileged person, but we would say, well, you are then the other. You then, in your identity client then, means that you do not belong to the normative group. You are not part of my dominant identity or dominant group. So we automatically set up an oppressive relationship with our clients by saying that we work with diversity. Now, what's really interesting is that this working with diversity language or concept is used throughout all of our trainings and teachings, and there is such inherent problems with it. And I think, personally, I think that the reason why this working with diversity concept is taught is because it's never been deconstructed to understand what we're actually doing relationally. Why? Because remember what I said earlier, if the profession is a reflection of the out there, the same structural inequalities that exist out there are being repeated in here. And we see this most evidently when we see this concept of working with diversity, because we are reproducing and repeating a very oppressive, supremacist position out there in here. We are repeating that we out there are powerful and dominant, and therefore, as a profession, in my position as counsellor, I am normative, I am dominant, I am in that powerful, I'm at that powerful end of these systems of oppression. So the working with diversity concept in and of itself is oppressive because it sets up this relational dynamic. And therefore, then there are inherent issues with it. They are oppressive. And I kind of mentioned these already, but for the first one, then it becomes a bolt-on. The very concept of working with diversity becomes not only a bolt-on relationally with the client, it also becomes a bolt-on then in the training. So the training is systemically unequal because we teach it. Not only that we teach the concept of working with diversity, but we also teach it as a bolt-on. Oh, we'll do a day on it. We'll do a day on working with diversity, or a half a day, or a module. We actually teach it as a bolt-on rather than an embedded part of our relationships. It's oppressive because it is the client then that holds the entirety of diversity, and we set ourselves up as the counsellor as normative. And by doing that, that in and of it, that actually sums up an oppressive relationship. That is what oppression is right there, is that we say that the client is diverse or different and we are normative. Part of that oppressive dynamic then, relationship, is then that my identity as the counsellor then is entirely missing. Why? Because if all of diversity and difference is with the client, and by placing myself as normative, I then do not need to think about myself as normative. And interestingly, I think this is where the concept of blank slate has been really weaponized. I think we often think about the counsellor's blank slate traditionally as, oh, well, I don't self-disclose, and I'm a blank slate so that the client can project onto me and psychodynamically, psychoanalytically through transference. But I think it also reinforces, maybe unintentionally, maybe unconsciously, but still oppressively, it reinforces the position of the counsellor being a blank slate. We miss our identity. And because of that, then ultimately our identity is missing as an ingredient in the recipe or the mix of what is happening in here. By ignoring what our identity is, by saying we're a blank slate, we are missing the biggest ingredient of what is happening in our therapeutic processes and relationships. It's the equivalent of trying to bake a cake and saying we don't need flour in a traditional recipe. Yeah. What we then think about then is that, or what we then don't think about then is, if we're missing the counsellor's identity, we are then completely ignoring then any relational dynamic and power in the therapeutic relationship. Because if we're saying we're working with diversity, we are saying that, unconsciously and unintentionally, this is an oppressive dynamic. And so we're therefore not going to think about oppression in here. Why would we? We want to ignore the fact that there are any oppressions or oppressive dynamics happening in here, because then I'd have to acknowledge that I'm positioning myself as normative. And so what we end up doing ultimately with this concept of working with diversity, we are reducing it down to only thinking about the client's identity. So for me, and this is, you know, a huge part of the work that I do, is to recognize that this kind of what has become a very traditional, embedded concept in our trainings, in our curriculums, and in our practice, this concept of working with diversity is inherently oppressive, is actually what is upholding these systemic inequalities in our work. And when we are taught it as working with diversity, this is why then in the trainings, we then will have working with diversity. But what then is that the kind of domino effect of it is then in practice, in counselling services, if we carry this concept of working with diversity into our practice, this is why then we have such problems of barriers to accessing minoritized communities. It's why we have less uptake of minoritized, marginalized communities accessing mainstream services, because we are actually reinforcing this idea, we're actually further marginalizing them. So there's something here about the problems are not the communities, the problem is the profession, the problem is how we actually consider identity in the first place. So for me, this is a deconstruction of the working with diversity concept. This is the deconstruction of why our profession and why our practice is oppressive. Like, this is evidence of why we can find ourselves unintentionally and unconsciously colluding with the system if we say that we are working with diversity and or difference, because we are then reinforcing these particular relational dynamics with our clients. So this is the problem of working with diversity. So by deconstructing oppressive practice, we can now then reconstruct it in an anti-oppressive position, and that is working within diversity. So when I talk about working within diversity, we have the same starting point, counsellor and client, or supervisor, supervisee, or tutor and student. But when we're working within diversity, in all those relationships, we recognise that we are in a two-way therapeutic supervisional teaching relationship, that there are two people in that relationship. And of course, if we're in a group setting, it's multiple two-way relationships. When we say we are therefore then in a two-way relationship, we recognise then that there are two identities that coexist, and therefore it is two identities that are in relationship with one another. And what you'll notice is that neither the counsellor or the client is being labelled as diverse or different, that each person in any relationship then is being held in mind with their individual identity and their intersectionality. When we then recognise that all of us are holding our own individual, unique intersectional identity, and we are all in relationship with each other, we then recognise that diversity is not an identity itself, but rather diversity is the context within which we all exist. And every time I think of this slide, I think of the metaphor of the swimming pool, that diversity is the swimming pool in which we all exist within. So diversity is no longer an identity label. Diversity is the context to which we all exist within. And all of us are within this swimming pool. And when we are in this swimming pool of diversity, what we are holding is not a label of difference or diverse or diversity. We are holding our own individual identity. So therefore then, when we are all within diversity, we are therefore then, all of us are working within diversity. Diversity does not get reduced down to an individual, but rather diversity is the context within which we all exist. And when we take this as a starting point of anti-oppressive practice, we then can start to recognise how we can then work within diversity and offer equality, how we can offer a place of understanding that within our work, within our relationships, we can actually start to balance out that seesaw. And we do that by taking this as a starting point of the model, and we place it within the full 5-component model. So this is the 5-component anti-oppressive model of working within diversity. So that smaller rectangle then is that swimming pool, okay? Just as I've explained. That context of the profession, that diversity within which we all belong, all exists then within the first broader context of counselling and the out there world. So component number 1 is to recognise that our profession has its own specific structural and systemic context, and the systemic and structural context of counselling exists within the broader out there world. So we're recognising that there is a specific structural and systemic context of counselling that is a reflection of the out there. That the structural and systemic context, our profession, our work, does not take place within a vacuum or a bubble. That the in here, like context, component number 1 essentially is the in here of our entire profession, and it is based upon structural and systemic contexts of out there. And so our structural and systemic context in here of counselling is going to be one of inequality, and therefore we have to consciously try and move that into equality. When we're then thinking about specifically then within our structural and systemic context of counselling, and we're talking about the clinical practice, we then think about the in here of the counselling room or supervision room or teaching space. And there are then 4 further components to consider. Number 2 being the identity and intersectionality of each of us in relationship. And then in our 2-way relationship, we then need to consider the 3rd component of power. We've already started to think about that already, but there's a lot more to be said on that, which I'll go into today. There is then thinking about, okay, so if we are then in therapeutic relationship, how does the other 4 components impact that? So how does structural and systemic contexts, how does identity, how does power, and how does our process influence the relationship? And then the 5th component, therapeutic process, again, what is happening in our work and what is it that we're doing in our work and how is that being influenced by the other 4 components? So all of these 5 components are in relationship with each other all the time. That because of our identity, because of structural and systemic context, how does that influence power between us? And therefore, how does that power then influence what happens in our relationship? And how does that then impact on the process? So these 5 components are constantly kind of talking to one another. It's not a case of only one is active in any given moment. That all 5 components are integrated and interrelated, so that ultimately what we are doing in our work is because of these 5 components. So how the work is unfolding with our clients, how we're experiencing and unfolding the work in supervision, and what might be happening in a teaching space is because of these 5 components. And so an anti-oppressive model is consistently considering these 5 components, therefore to think about, okay, what is happening in this seesaw and what can I do to help equalise this seesaw of power? What can I do to offer something that feels equal between all of us? What can I do what can I do in this space? And what within these components is influencing what is happening? Okay, so this is the 5-component model, and what we're going to kind of be deep diving specifically into today then is that component number 3 on power, and also a concept called cultural attunement, which is about how we can utilize these different components to think about how we can best relate to and work with our clients. So from this kind of starting point of the model, we're then going to be diving into thinking about power and thinking about this concept of cultural attunement. So as I've said, that's kind of the model and I appreciate there is so much to be said on this model, and of course there's an entire book on it. So if as I said, if after today, if this is appealing to you, there is so much more that you can learn about this model and the different components specifically, and how you can think about them in the work from the book. But as I said, we're going to be looking specifically at a couple of those today. I've got one final slide, and then we're going to come back to the gallery discussion group and then go for a break. But the final slide I want to say specifically on the broader model is that this model sits upon 7 principles. Again, the book will have this of course in all the detail, but essentially the 7 principles being that we are intentionally coming from a position of anti-oppression, anti-oppressive practice, rather than a position of inclusion or being inclusive. The reason I say that is because there is so much in the profession and broader in the social sphere right now around the work of EDI, around equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I want to make the distinction that inclusion is not the same as anti-oppressive. Inclusion is a gatekeeping mechanism that essentially says inclusion sits at the gatekeeping place of any space. Inclusion is about trying to make everybody inclusive into the space. I know the reason I think about it as a gatekeeping mechanism is because inclusion operates at the doorway. Inclusion is a mechanism that says, who do we allow into this space and who do we exclude? And inclusion is basically saying, we want to open up the doors and let everyone into the space. That is the extent of inclusion. What inclusion does not do is acknowledge then how people are accessing that space and how people then are experiencing the space once they're in it. So a metaphor that I often think about here is think about a supermarket. An inclusive supermarket would say, we're open 24/7. So that means everybody and anybody can access this space at any time. That is inclusion. What anti-oppressive practice or position would be is to say, first step is saying, yes, let's make the space inclusive. But more importantly, what anti-oppressive will do is say, but once you're in the space, we are then going to acknowledge how you experience this space. And we want everybody to experience this space equally. And that will then be thinking about power. That will be thinking about how do we level out that seesaw of power. Anti-oppression versus inclusion would be, anti-oppressive would be saying, as the supermarket manager, I am going to recognize the level of power and influence that I have in this space. And I'm going to acknowledge not only the power that I hold, but also how is that power being utilized and exerted over my customers? And how can I ensure that my customers come into this space feeling safe, feeling equal, and feeling equal to me? That when they're coming into this space, I am not oppressing them. Okay, so I'm making the real distinction here between anti-oppressive and inclusion. And because often people want to substitute one for the other or say that they're being inclusive when they mean anti-oppressive or vice versa. More often I'm seeing people saying, yes, I'm anti-oppressive. What they're actually doing is the inclusion piece only. Because, as I've said, anti-oppression, anti-oppressive practice acknowledges and works with the other 6 principles, whereas inclusion doesn't. So anti-oppression will include thinking about systemic, structural and social inequalities and oppressions in the in-here space, as well as the out-there space of our lived experiences. Anti-oppression will acknowledge that in any given relationship, there are 2 identities in that room. There is the identity of the counsellor and the client, or the supervisor and supervisee. And wherever there are 2 or multiple identities, there will be equal truths. So that if there are 2 identities, there will be 2 truths, because for each of us, we have our own truth and we are holding them equally. And therefore then, if in any given relationship, there are 2 identities, it then means in our practice, there are 2 identities. There is no such thing as a client and a blank slate. There is no such thing as diversity with the client and a therapist being neutral. There are two entire identities in any given therapeutic relationship. Being culturally attuned, we're going to talk about that in this afternoon section, but cultural attunement is, how do I then develop a relationship and attune to my client that again holds their truth with equality with mine? And of course, I'll say a lot more about being culturally attuned and developing cultural attunement later today. And ultimately, the seventh principle is that in this work, we are re-establishing that external context. We are not saying that counselling is a vacuum or exists in a bubble, that the out there is separate, but rather recognising that there is this external context of structural and systemic frameworks and inequalities, that our clients have their lived experience within those frameworks, and that external context and their lived experiences out there are the very thing that is being brought into the in here to be thought about. So this traditional, very old-fashioned concept that the in here is this special bubble or vacuum and it's just the two of us in this space cannot coexist with us sitting with a client's out there lived experience. Because the very thing we are working with, the very lived experience, the very thing that we are working with in here is that very same external context. The two are not separate. Yeah. So these are kind of the 7 principles that underline that framework. As I said, there's so much more that I talk about each of these in the book. So if you are interested in learning more specifically about any one, I do obviously recommend the book. But as I said, we're going to be thinking about cultural attunement, though, in today's workshop. I'm going to stop sharing and bring it back to the gallery. Now, I appreciate that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of setting that framework, that context of what we're going to be looking about today. Just want to hold some space for a few minutes for anybody to share any questions that they might have on it, or a reflection if they choose to. Who's that? Mona, please.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I only qualified a couple of years ago, and one of the things that I really, really found frustrating about training from both those who were teaching me, but also many of my peers, was the complete lack of understanding of what identity is and how it sits in the therapeutic space. And actually, I found with much of my course, unless I particularly went out and did it, I was not shown how to evaluate myself or how to become self-aware, or given kind of questions to ask myself, which would help both me, but also help me kind of understand a client's identity or a client's diversity. So there was nothing about my own self-awareness or what might be in front of me.
Yeah.
And kind of there were certain things that were taught, as in like, this is how you be a therapist. So things like self-disclosure, for example, is very much taught like those are bad things. Whereas actually increasingly more and more therapists are kind of disclosing certain elements about themselves. They're using it about in part of their marketing. You know, certainly doesn't become about the therapist, but is increasingly seen as relevant, particularly if you're working with certain client groups.
Yes.
And so, you know, I'm here today, we're all here today. So clearly we're the ones trying to learn these things and trying to be better. So I don't really know what my question is. I guess it's more of a reflection than anything. Because very much you're saying, well, there's 2 identities. Yes, I totally get that. But then I also don't even really know if I know my own identities. So, you know, really worked a lot to try and establish them, and I've really reflected on my different life experiences. And I guess demographics was the place that I started. But it's also kind of like a continuous learning. And I guess one other just reflection I'll say as well. So I'm British, but I live in Ireland, and I qualified in Ireland. And one of the things that I did, I used one of my modules to do it, was that I looked at Irish culture, because I was really aware that I was othered. I othered myself.
Yes.
Just based on the fact I don't have Irish family, I didn't grow up in Ireland. So it's kind of interesting that this power dynamic, that the therapist is seen as neutral and the client is the one with the diversity, that for me, like I walked in with a certain level of acknowledgement that I had diversity because I'd othered myself. So I don't know if that's a certain power dynamic in itself. I guess it's, again, more of a reflection than anything.
Yeah. But I think also this, thank you for sharing that, Mona, because this, again, a couple of thoughts on that is, one, I think it goes to show that when it's not taught to us, we then think it's not important, not necessarily not important, but we think, oh, it's a bolt on or something I need to do in my own time. But if it's not embedded in the training, we then don't have its core and central to our practice. And it's interesting as well, Mona, that then you're also then starting to recognise that actually my identity is having an impact, because being just that single identity characteristic of nationality and saying, oh, I'm British. But if you're working then in a Irish context, straight away there is a identity in the room that's being disclosed, and it's going to have an impact then on how your client might perceive you, and equally how you might in reverse perceive your client. So it's already there. So it's a really good example of how absolutely knowing our identity construct, and how our identity is constructed, which aspects of our identity are going to be influential or impact the work. And we're going to again be thinking about that today as well. So I'll be offering you a specific tool to help you think about your identity. So thank you for sharing that.
That's helpful, thank you.
Alina, please.
So, hi. I kind of wanted to add on to what Mona was saying. I kind of had like a similar experience in my education. It was interesting because in some ways it was the opposite. I've only just finished, but we spent so much time trying to figure out our own identity and question it. We had these PD groups where we would sit for literal hours together and just like feel emotions. And that was really difficult to do because some of us are just less emotional than other people. So there was such an emphasis on trying to, why do you think like that? Why is your identity like that? But then when it came to things like, for example, I have ADHD, they would still say, oh, that's neurodiverse. Or they would say, oh yeah, but there's cultural differences, and put like one little slide on there and not really acknowledge that. And so even when we were trying to talk about our differences or our identity or anything like that, it was always like, okay, but how does it feel? And it was difficult to sort of compartmentalize that identity into how our feeling and and like changing all those things around. And it was very confusing because the message just didn't seem to be very clear. And so reflecting on what you were saying about the whole therapist identity, it's also, we were also taught, don't self-disclose. Why do you need to self-disclose? It's don't do that. And so it was about finding that balance. And again, because I'm only fresh out of education, it's really interesting for me to learn this now before I go into really in-depth practices. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing your experience, because again, there's something about what that reminds me of is actually, that's a really good example, maybe not good for you, but for us maybe it's a teaching example. That's a really good example of working with diversity and why it doesn't work, because we're saying, okay, think about your identity, but then simultaneously, can you just compartmentalize it and put it to one side? The moment we are doing that, or saying that there is a distinction between our identities and then being a therapist, we have not only oppressed ourselves, but by doing that, we have oppressed identity generally, by saying that that's what we're going to do in the room. Because if we're going to do that to ourselves, we're going to do that to our client as well. So the idea of kind of, the idea of, here's a slide on ADHD or a particular identity, that is working with diversity in action, and that's why it doesn't work. Yeah. But again, hopefully today we'll kind of in similar kind of response to what Mona was saying, is about, hopefully today then we'll recognise, how do we think about our identities, in our own identities, and more importantly, beyond that, how can we then think about identity and its impact in the work and on the work, and equally our client's identity. So there's something about us, we're going beyond the first step of, well, who am I in my identity? It's about, okay, so then what? Now what? That's the bit for me that moves us into anti-oppressive practice. Yeah. Tommy, please. Somebody else had their hand up as well, so I think. So please put your hand back up again if that was you. Tommy, please.
I just want to say regarding the teaching, So I've taught for years counselling, and I agree. I've been round a bit as well. So in the West Midlands, I've taught most is, and that that repression starts from the top, because I've been told that you can't teach that. So teach EDI, but don't do too much of it. It's like it causes like to a point where I left mainstream and set up my own for training provider because of that reason. And I think for me, the way sometimes we're training therapists, and the supervisor said it all the while. We're training therapists actually not to be anti-oppressive. We're training them to be the opposite, and I think that's because tutors don't understand. And yes, there's the tutors that want to understand but can't because of the CPD at the college or the university, or there's the tutor that doesn't want to understand. And I've worked with both. I've worked with both. So for me, the team that I have led previously and the team that I do lead now, it is about bringing all of you in that teaching as well. So bringing every part of your identity in that teaching. Self-disclosure, I'm sitting here smiling because I absolutely agree. I mean, we say that we don't self-disclose, and then you've got a website self-disclosing. I mean, what's that about? So it is absolutely about bringing all of you as the tutor to the group, and for me, it's about as a counselor, as a supervisor, I help to know all of my clients, my supervisees well. I know what they tell me. I also do that with my students, and I encourage that. So we need to know everything about our students. Yes, they won't disclose everything straight away, but through that process of, and I've worked with students from level 2 to level 5. So I've known these students again 6 years, and by the end of that 6 years, they've stayed with us because we have got to know them as a person and their external and internal intersections.
Yes.
So that's what I want to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think and again, it kind of just reinforces this idea that it is about, again, we have to challenge the structures within which we do our work. It isn't just about what we do with the client. It's about how we change the systems of the profession itself. So thank you for sharing that, Tommy. Tanya, please.
Hi, sorry, I was just really kind of having some reflections, and then some of the things that I was thinking about, some people have mentioned it, but I didn't train in the UK. I trained in South Africa. And I guess coming and working in the UK, and I've been here for a long time now, but I think there is this complete disconnect between what we learn in terms of a very Western Eurocentric teachings of psychological practice that are completely devoid of any kind of social political understanding. And so there is a need to decolonize what we are learning, because it comes from a very specific point of view.
Absolutely.
So the non-disclosure, for example, and actually, I think even myself although my practice is more, or my teaching was more psychodynamic, but there was still quite a lot of emphasis on us as being the kind of blank slate for people to project onto. But I then went and I trained in what we call the Black University, which was very community-based. Started my training in what they used to be called white universities, and moved to a different one. And coming to the UK and bringing in community psychology practice has been a massive shock to the system, because people don't see psychologists or therapists in that way. So if I decide that I'm going to sit on the floor with this particular client I'm working with, because they're sitting on the floor, so why would I sit on the chair? I'll sit on the floor as well. And that means that I'm already creating a physical, visual representation of the power dynamic coming down.
Absolutely.
And it's still not seen as professional behavior in many places. And And I guess working within a forensic world, it's even worse because there are so many more limitations. And I do appreciate some of the risks, but there are a lot of fallacies in the sense that we talk about developing rapport in a therapeutic relationship, but we do that outside of the context of humanizing people first and humanizing the therapist too, because actually every person that I've worked with has come into the therapy room and looked at me and made an assumption about who I am based on what I look like. And depending on what I'm wearing or not wearing, they see me either as a particular identity or another identity, and they relate to me in that way. And so creating this explicit acknowledgement of who I am and what I represent, but also the boundaries of what I am willing to or not willing to talk about or disclose about me, because it may not be relevant to this conversation. It's equally important. So looking at the 7 principles, I really like this idea of 2 identities and 2 truths, because it's the one thing that I see all the time when we talk about ED&I, is that, you know, if we think about Black people or people from minority backgrounds, we should just understand them because they're all the same if they are part of that, and we're not. And for most of us with mixed heritage, we also use privilege at different points in time in different ways. And one of the biggest, I guess, the hardest thing in my life has been to have to acknowledge the amount of times that I've used privilege in an oppressive manner because it suited me. And because sometimes for me to be able to get to a position, you have to use that power, but you know that you're using that power perhaps against others. And it's really hard because it's something that you've inherited, and so you use it. And so without having that insight of what how that plays out in the therapy room or in the meeting room, then actually we will never get to a point where the other person can feel seen or heard totally. And so I was just kind of reflecting on that.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. The phrase that came to my mind as you were speaking there, Tanya, is, or when you're talking about kind of having privilege, we all have experiences of privilege and oppression, but because they are in relationship with one another, all privilege is oppressive. Yeah. So thank you, Tanya, for saying that. Hina, please, and then we'll go for a break after. Thank you, Hina.
Hiya, thank you. I just want to say I'm really enjoying this so far. I'm getting so much from it. I'm already answering the questions I wrote down this morning. So thanks, Myra. And also just wanted to say that just reflections on the concept of identity and just literally what Tanya was saying, and Tommy as well. It's quite interesting because when I first qualified, it was over 12 years ago. I'm from Dudley. I'm from the West Midlands. Hi, Tommy. You're a West Midlandser as well, aren't you, mate? But like literally just then I've used the word mate. Now for me, it's a very Dudley Black country phrase. And I remember when I was qualifying, as part of my identity, and my instructor said, trainer said, Penna, no one's your friend in that room. Don't use that phrase. You know, you've got to come across as that kind of blank slate. And it took me a long time. And now I say, like, my profile is I bring myself into the counselling room. And, you know, and I'll say I'm very Dudley, I'm very, you know, Black country born and bred. And actually that's what my clients relate to.
Yeah.
They relate to who I am in that room. And there's a concept of identity. I was just going to say to Mona that for me, I'm always exploring it. I'm always, my identity changes. I feel like it changes all the time, depending on who I meet, depending on what's happening, what's going on in life, do you know? So yeah, I just wanted to kind of reflect that at this point. I'm aware that we're going to have a break, but thank you so much already. Yeah.
No, thank you, Hannah, for sharing that. I think ultimately this pivot from oppressive to anti-oppressive is to actually recognize. It's almost like a wake-up call. You know, when you realize, it's almost like recognize, sounds weird, like you recognize you're in the matrix kind of thing. It's like recognizing that, oh my God, I exist now within this system that I didn't realize was set up in this way. And whether that's through recognizing, gosh, my training didn't prepare me for this, or oh, I'm working within this particular systemic or oppressive dynamic, or Hannah, equally what you've just said, it's like, oh, you realize that, oh, our training actually was getting rid of my identity and trying to get me to be this blank slate. To shift then and pivot into anti-oppressive is to, in a way, we are unconditioning ourselves from those very systems and structures that we trained in, and to then say, actually, I need to do this in a way that's going to go against the grain because I'm now choosing to step outside of that oppressive system. So that's why I'm saying that to make this intentional pivot to anti-oppressive practice is to challenge the very system that we all exist within professionally, and also to undo the very things, to undo some of the very things that we were trained to do. So yeah, kind of just off the back of Henna, what you were just saying. Thank you all so much. Who's that? Yvette?
Yeah, I've just got a quick question.
Sure.
Obviously training has been like quite a common theme. I
Yeah.
think for me as well, I had issues and difficulties with my training as well. Do you think, or who decides the curriculum? How can we move away from we all learn different things, and we move away from not only Eurocentric, but we learn other things? That's all, you know, it's given the choice for students that we, and if we can talking in terms of representation, then the training should reflect that. So how do you think can we or will we move away or incorporate Eurocentric and others? That's what I would like to kind of see.
There is work being done. So it's kind of a side note here. So there is the Coalition for Inclusion and Anti-Oppressive Practice published a toolkit last year. It's called Race is Complicated. That was one of the resources we created to start to do some of this kind of challenge the trainings. So that's a toolkit to further support training institutions to actually decolonize the curriculum, to think about how they actually teach the actual systemic structures of their institutions. So that's a toolkit aimed directly at institutions, program leads and tutors. That's free to download from the Place to Be website and any of the coalition organisations. It's on our My MCAPN website as well. So there's that happening. There is lots of effort going into kind of decolonising curriculums across various training institutions. So there's that happening as well. What else? There are things happening. Oh yeah, of course. Ethical frameworks are going through reviews right now. So I know certainly within BACP, they're going through the ethical framework review, for which we're moving into incorporating anti-oppressive practice into that ethical framework. And of course, the ethical framework for any professional body becomes the kind of, don't say, it becomes the kind of guidebook or the framework then for which all curriculums are based on. So if we change it at the very heart of it, which is ethical practice, we then change it in the curriculums. Does that make sense? So when there is now work happening to incorporate anti-oppressive practice beyond EDI into ethical frameworks, any training institution then, and certainly any accredited training institution, is going to go, oh, if that's the new framework, our curriculums now have to match that. So I'm really, really pleased to see that changes are happening at all of these very particular levels within the profession, because if we only change them at practice only, it won't change systemically, but there is work happening systemically to do that. There was something else, but I've forgotten about it. But the reason I know all of that is because I'm very, very, very privileged. I'm using that word intentionally. I know that I'm incredibly privileged to be in a position within the profession to be involved with all of that stuff. So, and hence my work is infiltrating, dare I use the word, it is influencing, it is getting adopted and embedded into these different levels of the profession. And that goes right up to, you know, at the very heart of ethical framework, which for me then, that's what trickles down then into curriculums and into training toolkits and decolonising curriculums. And my book then is kind of core reading on lots of training institutions now for that reason. So yeah, hope that answers your question, Yvette. Yeah, lovely.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, good stuff. So yeah, there is hope. So we'll hold on to that hope for today. Let's go for a break. We're at 11:24, so I apologise for running into a break slightly later. We're going to take a 20-minute break. So if we come back at 1:45, so a 21-minute break, come back at 11:45, and then we'll go into section 2. Okay.